The Communion of Saints is a series that seeks to share information on the life and times of the saints of the Catholic Church. Your program hosts are Father Jim Corda and Father Jack Lavelle.
Hello and welcome to the Communion of Saints. I'm Father Jim Corda.
And I'm Father Jack Lavelle.
The saint that we are going to begin our discussion about today is Saint Josephine Bakhita. She is a Sudanese and she is a religious woman. And let's talk, Father Lavelle, a little bit about the beginnings of her life. Let's talk about just the Sudan and what might have been going on at that time in Africa.
Well, certainly her life in Africa was one of hardship. She was a slave. And it's very interesting how she comes to end up where she does. She's a slave in the Sudan. She gains employment in whatever form that meant with someone from the consulate, the Italian consulate, and actually ends up caring for the gentleman in the consulate and his wife's child. But her life before that would have been one of difficulty. Being a slave, a black slave in the Sudan, life would have been very difficult. Much like we would think of slavery here in the United States in the 1800s, the same thing is going on at that time for her. And she's born in about 1869, somewhere around there. So it's just after slavery has ended here in the United States, but still rampant in Africa, and certainly would have had no knowledge of the Christian faith.
And what's interesting too is when she leaves the Sudan, because the consulate and his family have to flee because of some unrest there, they take her with them. And when she gets to Italy, she eventually is taken, her and the little girl that she is the nanny for, to a group of sisters, religious women. And the husband and wife go back to do some additional work. And when they come back to take the daughter and their not slave, but their worker, this Ms. Bakhita, with them, she decides that she wants to stay. She has become so endeared with these religious women that she feels a vocation herself. And so there's, what's interesting is that at the time, there was a law in Italy that allowed those people who were not citizens, if they desired to stay in the country, were allowed to stay. And so at the time, that was her option. And so she was not forced to go back to Sudan or to leave Italy itself, and found consolation, religious life with the Daughters of Charity. You know, the Daughters of Charity, obviously, like many religious orders, have particular charisms. And obviously one of their charism would have been the whole sense of charity. In your work with charity, how important is that virtue within the religious life and also religious practice?
Well, I think it's essential. And as you said, that totality, the whole person. We tend to see charity, perhaps for those of us in the church, as giving to this or giving to that, but it really is a whole way of living. The sense that the word charity comes from caritas, which is also love. It is that love, that complete love for God's creation, for our brothers and sisters in the Lord. And so certainly the Sisters of Charity, and certainly Josephine, as she becomes one of them, would have developed this great love for humanity. Certainly it must have been very difficult for her decision. We can't think it was an easy decision. She would have loved this family. She would have certainly loved this little girl, and they were providing her the opportunity to stay with them and to become a member of their family. As you said, no longer a slave, an employee, but we know many nannies and governesses and people that care for children, they become part of the family. It must have been very difficult for her to separate from that love, but they, by bringing her to Italy, provided her another family. So there was a great love and affection for this new family, but first and foremost for this faith that they invited her to share in.
What's interesting is her name itself, Bakhita, means lucky one or fortunate one. And so in her very life, she was fortunate enough to leave the problems in the Sudan and come to a country that perhaps might have been in the midst of war, but still finding comfort and consolation, and also an opportunity for this faith that was germinating within her to come to fruition. She was actually beatified in 1992 by John Paul II and then canonized by him in the year 2000. So she is one of the many saints, and we talked about this in another segment about how he canonized more saints than perhaps any other pontiff in the history of the Catholic Church.
Absolutely, and we see, as we've discussed in other episodes, choosing a saint from a land where most people would not think of any participation in the Christian faith, a Sudanese slave, who is not a missionary by going back to the Sudan, but who has great affection for the people that were in the same circumstances she was, to overcome physical slavery, but then to work and to pray and to dedicate her life to people who perhaps were slaves in other ways, from a lack of spirituality, from a lack of affection, whatever it may be, to try to free them through her ministry and her service. So although she left the Sudan and certainly ministered to other people, she still carried with her that love and affection for them.
You mentioned something about, we have a few minutes left of our first segment, about slavery. Slavery doesn't always come in the forms of shackles and chains. Slavery comes in many forms. We are slaves to lots of things within our lives. But we don't always think of slavery in terms of spiritual slavery, and how often people are really shackled because they don't have that spirituality or don't have that hope or trust that is needed in order to break off those chains that enslave someone from actually opening their heart and giving their heart totally to the Lord. And so Josephine Bakhita really becomes a model of Christian hope. She is someone that others can look to who might be in spiritual slavery, as someone who has overcome great obstacles and also found consolation in religious life and continue to nurture that to the old age of 78.
Absolutely. And we hear the language of the church, that being a slave to sin, and that slavery to sin is not the specific activities that are of a sinful nature, but at heart, sin is when we break that relationship with God, and many times then break that relationship with others, with our brothers and sisters. And so for her to strive to free people, to find a spirituality that reconnects those relationships. So not to be a slave to sin, but through the relationship with God, the relationship with others, to be free.
And we just want to note before we close that Josephine was the name that she chose at her baptism. Yes. We're going to take a break. Stay with us. We'll be right back.
I am Marino.
Yo soy Marino.
Marino, an American Catholic organization of priests and brothers, has been reaching out to those in need for nearly 100 years in 26 countries throughout the world. Missioners, workers, volunteers, supporters, we are all Marino.
I'm Father Mike, and I am Marino.
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 There is a place where a total stranger will give you their blood. There is a place where someone you never knew will save your child from drowning. A place where people from 7 states away will turn up at your door and give you food and shelter after a flood. There's a place where a person who doesn't look like you, talk like you, or dress like you will stretch out their hand and put it across your shoulders and say, everything is going to be okay. That place is called America, where we look out for each other and it's up to us to keep it that way. When you help the American Red Cross, you help America.
Welcome back to Communion of Saints. Now we're going to talk about a relatively unknown saint whose name is Sharbel Makhluf, who is a Maronite and a hermit. Let's talk a little bit, Father Lavelle, about the Maronite rite. We know that within the Roman Catholic Church there are various rites, and the Maronite is one of them. And even here in our own diocese, and I know many dioceses throughout the country, they celebrate that within different provinces. Mm-hmm. So anything that we could share with the folks that are with us about the Maronite community?
Well, I think first and foremost, as you've mentioned, it's within the Catholic Church. I know there are many people that get very confused and think, well, if it's not Roman Catholic, it's not Catholic. And how often we're asked questions about, well, what about the Byzantines? And what about the Maronites? And what about these different groups? So they are very much our brothers and sisters in the Lord in the Catholic faith. There is an exhibit of a different sense of liturgy. They use different language, though, you know, Vatican II's put our liturgy into the vernacular of the people. Latin is still the official language of the Church. In their liturgy, they do use perhaps even more original language. They use Aramaic, which was the language that Jesus himself spoke. And it would have more of that Eastern flair. You know, we tend to see a great deal of incense, a great deal of different iconography and imagery in the liturgy, and tapping into the roots of their Holy Land.
I think another thing that's interesting is he is a saint from Lebanon. Mm-hmm. And Lebanon is a rather Christian country, and yet throughout its history it's had lots of internal strife. And so those Christians within the country of Lebanon have found themselves oftentimes persecuted because of their faith and their Christian faith. And so we find in Sharbel someone who, in a sense, has really removed himself from society as a hermit, which ultimately is what hermits do. But he himself was not very well. He was always rather sickly himself, but he is really a symbol for the Lebanese people of poverty and of penance. Someone who, in the midst of all of this struggle within his country, uses that time and that opportunity in his religious life to atone for the problems and the sins that are happening within Lebanon, and also living austere poverty, and how hermits choose to do that kind of life oftentimes evades our own logic. We don't understand why someone would want to lock themselves up in prayer, and yet that is their whole modus operandi in life, is to pray.
Absolutely. And I do think, going back to when you mentioned about the very Christian atmosphere within Lebanon. Again, in our country and in our current time, with the strife we hear in different parts of the Middle East, we tend to forget the Christian presence. You know, we tend to forget this is the land of Jesus, you know, in the Middle East. And so we forget that as the Christian faith grew, where did it first grow from? And so we tend to not think of pockets of Christian communities, but very much so, and Lebanon indeed. But you are right, there is turmoil and strife. And so as a hermit, he doesn't remove himself from the care or the concern of the Christian community, and even people who are not Christian. But he does not want to physically be part of the strife. But does not remove himself spiritually or emotionally from it. And so he removes himself physically to engage in that prayer for peace, that prayer for justice, that prayer for people coming together and being able to get along. And then in his own austerity, much like Jesus, is atoning for our sins. Perhaps his biggest atonement would be for the sins of his own land, that they could not come together in a sense of peace.
And of course, he was canonized in 1977, So really at the end, almost to the very end of Paul VI's pontificate. And so coming off of the heels of Vatican II, a short 10 years or more, there's that whole sense of the Church universal. The Church is truly ecumenical, and so are the saints as well. You know, oftentimes when we think of the saints, and in our own show, we've talked about saints from Europe and so forth, but the saints are universal as well. And so highlighting in his pontificate someone from Lebanon is really significant.
Absolutely, and that would have been seen not just as a gesture, but it would have been seen really as a great opportunity for unity. You know, that the Holy Father is canonizing this Lebanese saint, this Maronite monk, to continue to show unity, even though there are small differences, that we are all one.
And what's interesting is his feast day is July 24th. And normally in the lives of saints, their feast day is significant, and usually around either the time of their death or the date of their death or some significant moment within their life. But what's interesting is he actually died on Christmas Eve. And so obviously we could not celebrate the saint's feast on the eve of our Savior's birth, but there's some significance of the Lord calling him at this time in his life. And you know, when we think about celebration of Christmas and the incarnation, there's that whole sense of being born again. And so we know that Sharbel, on the eve of his death on Christmas Eve, was actually born again into new life in Christ. Absolutely. So there's that whole cycle that happened. And of course, he was at the ripe old age at that time of 70 years old when he passed away. Anything else that we'd like to share with the folks that are with us about monks or hermits or this austere life that some of them choose to live?
Well, I think as you mentioned, that it's so removed from many of our thoughts of how to live our lives. We can be so caught up with consumerism and with all of these things that compete for our attention and our time, and that there is great value in removing yourself from all of these trappings. And though we are not called, perhaps, to become like Sharbel and to completely remove ourselves, it does afford us the opportunity to see how can I perhaps remove some things, reduce some of the trappings and the activities and the behaviors and the desires that are keeping me from focusing on God. You know, one of the great things of the Lenten journey is why we sacrifice isn't to just go on a Catholic diet for 40 days or to give something up for a few weeks. It's to say there are a lot of things competing for my devotion to God, and I need to strip some of them away. And Sharbel gives us that example.
We just want to close real quick with this segment, that when his grave was exhumed in preparation for his canonization, that once the casket was open, that many miracles occurred within the region, and there was this resurgence and revolution of the faith in Lebanon at the time. So that continues to happen in the lives of saints and in the lives of ordinary people. We're going to talk about another saint in just a moment. We'll be right back.
What have you done for your marriage today?
I gave my wife a hug this morning. I told her I love her.
I did her hair this morning. I think it looks pretty good.
I cooked my husband's favorite breakfast.
I bought her an orchid.
What have I done for my marriage today? I sent my husband a love email.
I read the newspaper to my wife, and it cracked her up. But she's still laughing.
What have you done for your marriage today? Make a change for the better. Need help? Go to foryourmarriage.org, a message from the Catholic Church.
Hello and welcome back to Communion of Saints. We're going to talk now about Padre Pio of Pietrelcina. And he was 81 when he passed away. His cult is very alive and very significant. He was the first stigmatized priest in history. Let's talk a little bit about Padre Pio and what we know about him.
Well, as you said, there is a great cult that still follows around him. The reality is he has only been dead for less than 50 years. So there are many people who knew his story while he was still with us. You can encounter people in their 70s or 80s who knew his story when they were growing up in the faith and maybe even journeyed to try to get close. But very much the hallmark is this incredible devotion, and that he gives this sense of uniting with Christ. And I think that's why certain saints, whether we call them bandwagon saints or grassroots saints, why their cause springs up is that people are searching. They're searching for something. And he provided perhaps a serenity and a calm, but also a unification with Christ. Certainly the stigmatism that he had would have shown that. And it would have been something that might have been novel for people, but then brought them in.
It's interesting because you mentioned the word searching, and I remember when I was in the seminary many years ago, over 36 years ago, and many of the young men at the time, probably because of age, right out of high school, were searching and went to the seminary to try it out, to see if this was something that they wanted or that they liked. Many of them left, as we know. A few stayed. What's interesting about Padre Pio is that at the age of 5, he knew that he wanted to be a priest. And that was his goal in life. Interestingly enough, too, he was a very sickly person. He was not someone who had lots of capabilities, and yet he had a tremendous need to serve God's people. And he did that generously. And so this whole searching that you had mentioned before was not part of his life, but because his life was so settled and so noted, that he was able to give that calm to people who might be searching, especially spiritually, and how important it is for those who are searching, those who are doubting, to be someone who can direct them to the right way and to the right road to God himself.
Absolutely. And when you use the word doubting, I kept thinking of Thomas, who doubted in his faith, but who encounters the risen Christ with the nail marks in his hands. And that there are times when we need to move beyond our doubts. We would hope that all of us would have faith that is strong enough, but sometimes we need living symbols and we need living signs of that continuing in the faith. And I think that's exactly what Padre Pio became for so many and continues to offer to people. One of the other things perhaps about some of those bandwagon saints, we can see rise and fall in their popularity. The popularity of Padre Pio has maintained steady since his death in 1968, and then even a greater resurgence with his canonization.
Correct. And I think the other thing is this man was saddled with the stigmata for 50 years. As we had mentioned before, this was not something that he sought out or something that he rejoiced in, but it was part of his life. And he endured that for 50 years. But it was said that once he passed away, that his wounds automatically cleared up and became invisible. And so there's that whole sense that once one dies, that one enters this newness of life and this rebirth, as we had mentioned earlier in the life of another saint. But also, interestingly enough, in the life and ministry of Padre Pio, they say that he was able to read people's souls. So when they came to him for confession or consolation or counseling, he actually knew what was in someone's heart before they spoke. Sometimes that's a gift, sometimes that could be a curse. But it harkens back to the scriptures where Jesus understood what was in the souls of humans and how important that facet of his divine life was. And that was a blessing that was given to Padre Pio as well, to be able to read what's in the human heart, and how difficult that is sometimes. And I think further, sometimes it's difficult for people to express themselves or to actually say what's in their heart. And so to have someone who could read that would make all the difference in the world.
Absolutely. And it's different from a magician's trick of reading a mind. You know, what are you thinking of? What's your favorite color? What's your favorite number? This is someone's very being. You know, to read one's soul, to be able to examine their motivation, their desire, to look into their heart. And like you said, a gift and a curse, because there would be many that he would have encountered some very difficult souls. But to continue to work through and to continue to challenge and guide and lead them, which ultimately I think is probably what they were all looking for. Even in their own minds, they might have been thinking something different when they encountered Padre Pio, but by presenting their soul to him, they perhaps discovered a greater way.
In our last 2 minutes of this show, what I'd like us to talk about and to maybe delve into is the whole sense of vocation. You know, we are in a church nowadays that needs more vocations to the priesthood and religious life. In the person of Padre Pio, we see someone who at a young age, at the age of 5, knew that this was what his vocation was, to be a priest. How many young people in our churches, in our community, probably have heard that call at a young age, but for some reason have not responded to that call? What might we share with them if they're listening today, or even their parents and grandparents or close friends who see within them something? Very briefly.
I think at the heart is to discover one's joy. When we look at all of these saints, even saints that had difficulties, that had challenges, there was a joy in not just serving God and not just serving others, but I would have to say there had to be that internal joy in feeling that they were doing what they were called to do. And I do think it's very difficult in our current age with vocations because people are searching for that joy. We go back to the word searching. They're searching for the fulfillment of that joy, but there's so many other things that stifle that voice. You know, they might be hearing God's voice, but again, going back to consumerism and the lure of a high-paying job or all the trappings of life, rather than finding one's joy. I think that has to be at the heart of any vocation.
And we want to say and close with that God continues to call men and women to service in the church. It's those others and individuals who have to be open to the call, but the call continues to come. Thanks for joining us. Have a good day, and God be with you.
The Communion of Saints was a production of CTNY, the Catholic Television Network of Youngstown. Your program hosts were Father Jim Corda and Father Jack Lavelle.
$33 million Americans have descended into poverty. And as their futures fall, so does our nation's.